make your emotions, expensive. You have to realize when you are trying to talk to people and form these connections, a lot of times we allow people to kind of walk over us in a sense. And a lot of times it could just be because we want this person so badly or kind of instilled so much value into this person. But ultimately, we have to realize that we can detach from this. We can detach from our emotions and kind of observe them in a sense. And I feel like the more, comfortable we are with doing this, the more capable we are of forming better connections. Instead of being so emotionally dependent on other people, we have to realize that now we can build our own connection, our own feelings, beyond other people. You're trying so hard to form these connections with others because you feel like that's the only thing that will bring you, this level of emotion. But really, we can be a lot more independent in this sense. We can be independent for how we feel and ultimately what we want. That emotion that you're trying to get from other people, it can kind of derive you in a sense. And honestly take away your empathy and capability for a lot of things. If you do want better emotions, you ultimately have to realize that. You have to be less emotionally, balanced and based on other people. You're allowing so many people to kind of affect your overall mood that now they get to control your perception, the way you move, the way you even think. Now it relates so heavily to this person, and it's not always going to be a bad thing, but it easily can become that. So easily can a good connection and a good feeling, or a good anything, get ruined as soon as something fails. Now that ruin is going to take over so much stronger. A lot of times we're more comfortable in that sadness just because we're more pensive in it. We now have not a really ambivalent feeling, but just a pure, sad, melancholic feeling about this thing. We have to be able to change. And with that change comes, moving on and forgiving people, instead of holding grudges. Grudges are something that's kind of damaging you in a sense. And I feel like a lot of people aren't even aware of it. You have to be able to move on, not without, any hatred, but with love and realize that you move. Grudges do nothing but hold you back. You have to realize because you're holding on to this hatred, you can't love fully. You can't love to your max, capacity because you're trying so hard to get back at this person. Because you feel like you have to get revenge or have to do something in order to feel better about yourself, or that you have to achieve certain something, for someone to get back at you. You have to realize that now that's going to affect you. And I feel like a lot of people get stuck on that. And a lot of people, kind of can be blinded with it, or feel like they're not doing it for a certain someone, but ultimately you are. And I feel like if you have to question it, that's even a more clear reason that you are doing that. When you are trying to form, newer things, that same hatred is going to be holding you back. That same feeling, that same everything is going to be, stuck with you because you buried it down deep. That's what getting revenge is. It's this, jealousy and love, turned so easily. And I feel like when you hold that grudge, you have to realize that it imprisons, yourself. That's the person it's affecting the most. Holding a grudge holds no one back but you. You can't love to your max extent. You can't love to your max capacity because you're trying so hard to get back at someone. You have to realize that you're not even doing these things for yourself anymore. You're doing it for other people to see it. And in that same sense, you are letting them control your life. That is now living and being dependent on by other people. As soon as you make your emotions more expensive in this sense, you don't have to deal with that anymore. You can be able to move on and not really deal with this feeling of needing revenge or needing to retaliate to someone who ultimately did you wrong. You can move on with forgiveness. As soon as you're able to love other people and not let that thing control you, you're now being yourself. You're now being complete in the sense of knowing that you've been able to move on. That's accurate healing. Instead of feeling like you have to do something or feeling like you have to change in a certain way or allow this kind of disrespect, you're able to move on and to have this idea that you're confident within yourself. You're capable of this love, not really something that you have to derive from someone else, but something that you're so full of and aware of for yourself. That is being comfortable and confident now that you've changed, and that change is needed. That change in your own, relationship with yourself is what I feel like it's the biggest. That relationship with yourself is something that I feel like not a lot of people are trying to put effort in. You're putting an effort in all these other relationships except the relationship that you have with yourself, the most important one, mind you. And I feel like if we want to kind of have our emotions at a higher state, have our emotions, more full and more comfortable and even confident with ourselves, we have to be more expensive with that thing. You have to stop being so emotionally dependent on other people. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like when you're waiting and trying so hard to get these people to value you, now your value means nothing unless this person says it does. That's exactly what it means to depend on other people. And I feel like when you do it emotionally, not even physically, emotionally, it's more damaging. That will honestly lead you more of astray and to lead you to change yourself. Stop being so emotionally dependent. When you're depending on these other people to tell you who you are, to tell you how much you're worth, you have to realize that now you're taking away that power from yourself. You can't identify yourself, or you kind of can't, describe your own value because you've been letting people do it for you, for so long. That takes away from who you are and ultimately what you deserve in the future. As soon as you let these people control you, because someone didn't text you back on time or give you the right attention or give you the right response, we are now letting this person, be our dependency. This is now our emotional state that we're letting this person control time and time again. And as soon as you let someone control, your own state of emotion, you have to realize that you've lost yourself. You've lost your own identity in this because you feel like this person has to give you, so much more. This person has to give you, something different to make you feel okay again. That's what it means to kind of lose that sense. If we were making our emotions, expensive and actually try to kind of have our own independence in the sense, we'd be able to move on, not with this idea that someone has to correct it, but that we correct it ourselves, that we are aware of it ourselves, not needing anyone to change it. As soon as we can do these things on our own, that's when we're moving on, correctly, instead of moving on. And I feel like a lot of people say they're moving on when really they're just kind of ignoring how they feel, or changing how they feel, when it has to be fixed. It has to be something you actively do. Ignoring your problems is just a distraction. And I feel like when you're building those distractions, you're not necessarily healing at all. You have to heal from these things. It's not just something that you can move on, or feel like you don't have to deal with right now, or kind of can let, resolve itself in the end. This isn't kind of a software thing that just changes. You're not software, you're not a robot, you're not AI. You have to put your own time into these things. And I feel like when people kind of feel like they can just change it, or do whatever, and kind of move on from it, now they're hurting themselves. It's kind of just distractions in the end. Are you healed, or are you trying to move on? Instead of healing, you've been distracting yourself. You've been filling yourself with this idea that you are okay, or gaslighting yourself that your feelings aren't hurt, or that you can move on and not really, face these things. And it's hurting yourself. These distractions are so temporary, but you kind of add on to them and feel like they can, solve this permanent issue, when really it's something you have to face on your own. You have to be able to show your wounds. You have to realize that the only good things, the only love that can really repair it and enter through is through those wounds. Those wounds are not really the things that can define you, but those are now guiding points to change. These are now reasons to realize, why you should be better, how you can be better, instead of feeling like you only be negative from now on, or can deal with, distractions time and time again to kind of get your mind off these things. You have to face it. You have to be brave in a sense. And I feel like a lot of times people are so scared of that they don't even like looking at themselves. These are the people that are trying so hard to talk to other people and to talk about other people because they don't like themselves. They don't like looking in the mirror. They don't like trying to build something real because they know they can't do it. They know they're incapable because they've been letting go of themselves. And when you let go of yourself, that is what it means to let go of your emotions. These same emotions that you can detach and observe from are now the things that are controlling you. And in that sense, I feel like the people that are letting that control them are the worst type of people. You have to realize that now these people are going to be the most self-centered, narcissistic people because they haven't been able to deal with their own issues. They don't need any validation from other people because they've validated themselves. And I feel like as soon as we start looking for that validation from other people, or feel like other people have to, add to things, or make us feel a certain way, it's completely wrong. You have your own validation. Anything you feel is now valid. You don't have to ask people, am I in the right or wrong in you? I feel like that's what a lot of people are doing. They need a second opinion for how you feel. There's no one controlling that. There's no one that can change that. And ultimately, that's how you feel. Living is your own definition. You don't need to be validated by anyone. How you feel is ultimately how you feel. You don't have to ask people or ask your friends, if you're in the right or wrong every single time. You have to realize that your right or wrong is important to you. This is now something that shouldn't be, affected by other people's perceptions or ideas, but it's something that you're comfortable and confident with. As soon as people start absorbing, rules they've seen on social media or the latest, TikTok theory, they have to realize that now they're hurting themselves. If you don't have your own definitions, how are you going to describe your own experience? That experience that continues, that, actively grows, is something that you have to learn from. This is going to be your lessons and your rule books for the future. You have to take a real and accurate look at yourself in your past and realize what you did and how you can grow, how these things will no longer hold you back, but kind of set you up for success in the future. That growth is exactly what we need to experience in order to have something better, in order to have something real. And I feel like not a lot of people want to face that. Not a lot of people want to kind of see that and accept that they're capable of this growth, even though it's uncomfortable, even though it hurts, but that hurt will follow us wherever we're at. And I feel like that hurt is something that our emotions can make us feel like we have to do, or we have to kind of abide by, or feel like they can change. But really, if we want to feel better about ourselves, we have to be more, not only independent, but we have to value our emotions and we have to observe them. You can detach from these things. That's what I think a lot of people don't want to do. They don't want to feel like they are their emotions, but they're kind of also unaware that they're capable of that thing. If you let go of your emotions, if you let go of those things and truly, value yourself and value the things that you are capable of doing, that you're capable of bringing, you'll be able to experience, life fully. You'll be able to experience relationships fully. And most of all, you'll be able to experience yourself, because not only will you be emotionally intelligent, but you'll be in tune and you'll be aware. And you have to be those things. If you want something real, you have to be real with yourself. And that's what a lot of people aren't willing to do.